Paul, over to you for your presentation.
Cool. Thank you, Suchi. Just share my screen. It's working, yeah?
Yes, it is.
Perfect. Alrighty. Um, I'm gonna sort of re-present what I did present very recently in Drupal South, which was this presentation on building digital experiences that align to digital service standards. Anyone that saw my presentation, there'll be obviously repeats here, but I think this session tonight is possibly an opportunity to be a bit more interactive. So if anyone wants to ask questions as we go along, please do so. Also, it might save anyone from having a look at the YouTube videos. I mean, Nigel just mentioned that the Drupal South videos are out, and I actually watched your video last night. I didn't make your session actually yesterday. I didn't make your session in the Drupal South, but I really liked the presentation. So um, again, these mine hasn't come out yet. I think the day two ones are coming out a bit later on, but might save you watching that. But like I say, I think we can be more interactive tonight, and feel free to ask me things as I go along. Um, in terms of what we will cover, I do talk about digital service standards. For those that are very, very techy, I don't know, hopefully you get something out of this. It's probably more around delivery, approaches to delivery. I will have a focus on the DTA's Digital Service Standard 2.0. And I guess part of what I was really trying to achieve at Drupal South was to dig into that, into the standard, but more particularly give my own sort of practical tips and guidelines on how to apply the standard. And that's sort of what I was really trying to achieve. So let's see how we go with that tonight. This is sort of the agenda that I went with. So brief introduction, context around digital service standards, sort of what is a standard, why have a standard, little bit about the DTA's DSS 2.0, which recently came out, and we'll get into that. I in doing a deep dive into the DSS 2.0, I also sort of had a look at what other digital standards are around the world. So just sort of touching on that, and part four is the main part of the presentation, which is the sort of practical tips and sort of my guidelines for applying the standard based on my own experiences. At the end, I had a recap and takeaways and Q&A. But as I say, this time we can have questions at the end. We can have questions as we go. Feel free to stop me. Uh, the raise hand I often miss, so maybe just shout out, or Suchi will probably say if there's a hand raised. Yeah, so I had this sort of quick introduction at Drupal South. So I neglected to talk about this when we were going around the table, but I have been doing sort of Drupal projects for probably since about 2012, and sort of delivering Drupal or such a digital programs for a lot longer. I could say how long, but it'll be showing my age, so I won't do that. But probably more than 20 years. Uh, in terms of sort of a basis to provide some of the tips and techniques that I'll get into, I am active in some very large digital programs. As many people in Salsa are, GovCMS is sort of a prime part of what we're doing. Also involved in New South Wales 1CX program, Victoria's single digital presence, and also WA's wa.gov.au. So, a lot of sort of experience there in terms of application of digital at scale. And I do sort of oversee where required, salsa large projects and large accounts as needed and as people need support. Um, when we're at the Drupal South, I sort of made mention of the sort of football match that was on round one that night. I am a member of Richmond, 29-year member, and there happened to be round one the Thursday night of when I presented. So went along to the game, and we beat Carlton, so that was good. So yeah, sort of context on digital standards, just sort of framing them. I think we could easily say, what's the point? Why have a standard? Amongst many reasons. to ensure user-friendly, accessible, secure, and efficient services are designed and built, to provide a framework for design and delivery decisions, and particularly in government, to promote cohesion and connection in government. So we could say, all these things are kind of easy, right? And I guess, without a standard, they're particularly not easy. Even with a standard, the aspiration is easy to say, but it's sort of harder to realize. And even with the standard, these are tricky problems. But I guess, armed with a standard and some guidelines, we have some chance of successful delivery and achieving the sort of objectives that I led off with. Without guidelines and principles, we're really flying blind and essentially making up as we go along, and we obviously don't want to do that. So how do we apply the standards? And that's, like I mentioned, what I really want to explore in this presentation. Yeah, so I thought it would be interesting to take a little bit of a look at other world efforts worldwide. What are other countries doing? So I had a bit of a look at this. It's not a sort of an exhaustive search, but my quick analysis discovered the um, UK effort, the UK GDS, or Government Digital Service. The principles are listed here. You'll see 1 to 10. I didn't deep dive into these in Drupal South because we were sort of limited on time. We could. I don't think it really matters that much, and I'll explain why that is when I get to comparing this against the Australian DSS 2.0 standard. But just to know, secondly, there's a standard from Scotland, the Scottish approach to service design, sort of uniquely named. But anyway, Scotland does have a approach to this, and the UN also has a approach to this too. And I think Siobhan, you worked on some UN projects, if I remember correctly. But anyway, they
Yeah.
have some guidelines here in terms of the UNDP, so that was kind of interesting. Um, Canada has their own digital service standard. The US has their US Digital Services Playbook, and the DTA has the DSS 2.0. And like I mentioned, that I'll dive deep into the principles of the DSS and discuss and provide some tips on that, on how to use them based on my experience. But I guess I started thinking about these things, and the principles are listed here, but how are they similar? How are they different? I thought that might just be interesting to have just sort of an understanding of. Um, don't get too worried about all the detail in this slide, but essentially what I tried to do was take each of the criteria that we saw across each of the worldwide efforts and try to look for commonality or equivalence even. And so I sort of had these groupings on the left-hand side, and it shows each of the 6 standards across the top, and the clustering of green is what I was really looking at, or even the non-clustering. So without needing to go into all the details, some of the principles were exactly the same. So we saw from the UN standard, we've got do no harm here, and similar in the DTA standard, do no harm, and then in terms of very, very similar, or all standards had start with the user needs, citizen participation, start with the need, understand user needs, etc., etc., and similarly with default to open and the like. So these are ones that are almost identical principle, at least in name. Then there was sort of very common principles clustered together. So that's where these sections have sort of lots of green and hardly any white space. So again, like having a look at this sort of encouraged me, because I just thought, oh, okay, well, if we have a really good understanding of the sort of Australian DSS 2.0, then just because they're so similar, then we'll have an understanding, or at least a rudimentary understanding of the other standards that are applicable around the world. And hopefully that stands to reason, because I'd be worried if the standards were sort of all over the place. But given they are aligned, diving deep into the Australian standard is contextual for the other standards and stuff going on around the world. I gave this slide just for people just to understand where does the digital service standard fit in with the sort of wider ecosystem of digital policy. And we step back, there is this digital experience policy, and underneath that digital experience policy is these four standards. One of those being the digital service standard. Um, in terms of what these other four standards are, I will dive deep into the digital service standard, as I mentioned, but a digital inclusion standard is about delivery of inclusive and accessible experiences. The digital access standard is about minimizing and consolidating access points. And the digital performance standard is about understanding it and improving performance. And again, we've got these sort of guiding principles or tenets of each of these standard. And again, there's overlap and blurriness, which I actually think is a good thing amongst these standards. So again, diving deep into DSS gives us some appreciation of these other standards and how they may be applicable to projects and building out of services. So, like I mentioned, wanted to sort of dive with that sort of context that I wanted to dive deep into the basic tenets of the DSS 2.0. Before we get there, a bit of background on the DSS and where it's come from, or where we are today. So, the DSS or Digital Service Standard has been around since December 2015. Um, the original standard had 13 criteria. In recent times, and I know Siobhan, you did some research into this, and there's actually a blog article on a Salsa website, so that's another context for people to know. But the most up-to-date version 2.0 has a refined set of criteria, and there's 10 criteria, and they really have a sort of increased emphasis on accessibility, security, collaboration, and service connection. And just to mention, we've done many projects in Salsa, and sometimes the RFQ, RFI sort of mandates, that the project should be delivered to the DSS standard. And I always like, when that's mentioned, because we've got sort of a framework of delivery. Even when it's not mentioned, there's just basic sensible things around the service standard. So, that's in our thoughts as well when we deliver projects for Salsa.
Shivan's got his hand up.
Oh, sorry,
We're
Siobhan.
good. We're good.
Well, yeah,
Yeah.
for those of you who are interested in the article that I wrote, I did a comparison between 1.0 and 2.0.
Mm.
So I could put a link, I could send a link to Sushi, maybe drop it in the chat at some point if anyone interested in reading that one.
Yeah, perfect. And obviously at the end, this is interactive, so you're expert on that sort of whatever difference, and feel free to field some questions. In terms of diving into these 10 criteria, so we will sort of tackle each one of these criteria in turn as we go. And again, I try to sort of give best practice and tips for application based on my own experience with each one of these, and we'll get into that. Um, how I dived into this, just so you'll see this per each criteria. I did start off with a quote per criteria, and I hope they're not too cheesy. I didn't make it too big deal of them, and we'll see that. But I did use a quote, and really it was my attempt to sort of contextualize the principle of all criteria. Then what I have per criteria is this what section, and this is largely lifted directly from the standard. It describes sort of what is expected, but and you could see this yourself if you open up the standard and have a look at it and read it. And I've got some links at the end to the standard. What I found though is it's a little bit lacking in the how. So yeah, do A, B, C, and D, but how? And I guess that's where I put these sort of how pro tips in. So what I tried to do there is based on my own and Salsa experience in delivering digital service, describe like how to apply, or maybe when to apply, or other situational based considerations. And really, it was my intention to have some useful takeaways. So when others are building digital services, they've got some sort of practical tips to consider, not necessarily do, but at least consider, and it's based on what I've seen work well. With each one of these criteria, what I also tried to do at the end was provide a why statement for each criteria, and this is sort of to further contextualize the how and the why of each principle. So why it would be really important to consider the principle again, sort of further contextualize. So we'll get into these criteria. First one is to have a clear intent. So in terms of the what, if you open up the standard and have a bit of a look at it, you'll see things like develop a business case for change, survey the policy landscape, etc. Similar things that you see under this what column here, and I'm left with, at least I was left with, so how do you do that? It's great to say what, but how do you do it? So I guess this is where the sort of practical tips come in. Things that I've seen work well, and feel free to stop me here now or later. We could drill in. I can explain where I've seen these and provide examples if you want. But just really, really important to agree success criteria. Entrench the success criteria in the project. Don't just have them as discovery deliverables, but refer to these as principles and criteria ongoing. Ensure outcomes of the project are solving problems. And it's really important, and maybe people have seen this, but it's really important not to jump too quickly to technical solutions. Prototypes, yes, but if we too quickly jump to solutions, we can often miss context and we can narrow down the opportunity. And in worst case, may even result in a service that just completely misses the mark. Also, the intent should be an ongoing point of reference used in the project. And I guess we can say, well, okay, great, A, B, and C, this is how, but why? Being clear on the intent helps us orientate the service and provides a reference point for the decisions. Criteria number 2, know your user. So what does this criteria involve? Again, in the standard, you'll see things like understand your users and test and validate designs. And these are all probably common sense principles, but I'm left with, or how do you do that? Or what's some practical ways to make this happen? Oops. So things that I've at least seen work well in the projects I've been involved with, the programs I've been involved with, is identify user personas, primary personas, secondary personas, and you can have other personas as well. Document them, use them in conceptual discussions. Use scaled user-centered design and user research. I've seen sort of programs or projects that have used very, very elaborate and complex, even expensive, for want of a better word, user research exercises. And I've seen some user research done in projects, and I've seen no user research done in projects. I guess each can have their place. Scale to what's needed, and largely it's a function of complexity of function. Rarely would I advocate no user research. In fact, I would never advocate that. At a minimum, the project team needs to do user research, and if the project can afford, or it's justified to have independent user research or research with actual users, I certainly would be looking at that. Ongoing validate assumptions with conceptual designs, and ideally do user test these with a cohort of representative users. Use clickable alpha prototypes and early beta releases. These types of things are really effective at sort of validating assumptions and to ensure you actually build for actual users. And again, we can say, why do we do this? The importance of knowing your user. Oh, actually, yes. What happened in the Drupal South? We had a keynote speaker from Nicola Nye, and she presented on humanizing technology. I'd really encourage anyone to have a look at this if you haven't seen it. It's actually the 2 keynotes are already available as videos on the site now, along with presentations like Nigel and others, and mine will be later. But Nicola presented this humanizing technology, and she sort of oh, explained, the risk of not sort of having the user front and center is systems that are just so convoluted and hard to use. And I thought her mapping this to humanizing technology was a really, really interesting listen. And, as I say, I'd really encourage people to have a look at that. So back to the why of know your user. Look, the service needs to be designed with the user in mind. Only then will it be high value. To not build with user input risks internal assumptions being wrong and a compromised service. Criteria number 3, leave no one behind. So from the standard, you'll see understand the diversity of users, understand relevant legislations and standards. Again, sort of common sensey type things. In terms of how, things that I've seen be particularly effective, use discovery and alpha phases to try to further discover personas. Continually ask, who have we missed? So I was speaking about the primary and secondary personas in the last criteria, but often there's tertiary criteria and personas, I should say, and others. And if we don't consider in a practical sense everyone, we may have missed someone in the service, and it won't be inclusive. Consider cultural, language, and socioeconomic factors in the service design. Use accessibility tools during design and build. Commission independent accessibility audits, ideally. Ensure accessible content is being used. So again, why? We need to consider all users to ensure the service is inclusive and accessible. This was also borne out in a really great presentation that Adrian from DSS did, and this is also a day one presentation, and it's up on the Drupal South site right now as a video. I'm a little bit biased in this because we did the project with Adrian and the DSS team, along with another agency, Jude, who did some of the governance work. But Adrian presented on how to make documents like Uber accessible, and it was really, really interesting. Sort of the logic and the rationale that was used by DSS. It actually followed some of this digital experience policy and some of the standards we're talking about today. But he gave some really, really practical examples of making like Uber accessible documents, and he also had this really interesting generated Auslan avatar, for want of a better word. So I think he just essentially showed a demo of feeding some sort of script straight into an Auslan avatar, and it presented the sort of sign language sort of on the fly. So they're really, really interesting, and I'd encourage anyone to have a look at that. Criteria number 4 is connect services. So again, in terms of what you'll see in the standard, this one is actually pretty light. Hope no one from the DTA is listening, but anyway, I found it pretty light. It basically said, just designed to be interoperable and join up services. I thought, okay, well, probably really need some pro tips here. So at least in my experience, discovery is the prime time for thinking about connection opportunities and if and how to leverage existing IP tools approaches. It's a classic sort of start broad, narrow later, but always have an eye for how could we connect? How would our service connect? How could we connect to other services to achieve what we're trying to do?
Well, I was just going to mention, I think another perspective from working in APS is also just, the interoperability of other systems and solutions that other agencies produce. So larger agencies, DSS and others, produce systems. You can connect with them, so the open data is probably a good one, but other areas there. But there are systems that other agencies can leverage, and the idea there is that, especially with the departments, where things have been built already, don't reinvent the wheel necessarily, but also consider where other systems can connect rather than having to build your own system or leverage what connections are available externally. So, and that's where it's talking about join up services as well.
Yeah, very good point. In fact, some of these points I've got down here, so glad we're sort of thinking like here, Akil. And obviously yours is based on real world experience. So excellent. So further things from my side, proving connection opportunity. You can prove connection opportunities into your sort of beta build. Use proof of integration acceptance criteria. Tackle the most risky and complex stuff first. Can be one strategy I've seen work well. It's not universal, but I've seen it work well. To your point, Akil, consider if you can supply open data as part of your service or use open data in your service, like essentially what you're talking about. Also, to be practical and in particular to operationalize some of these things, owning the service and its SLA is critical in connected services. A service product owner who's responsible for the service quality is really, really key. So, we can not think about that during the build and maybe it's appropriate, but when it gets put into operation, someone accountable for the service quality is really, really important. Again, why? I think we've sort of touched on this, but as much as possible, we need to aim to make government function as one. Connecting services can make this happen, and Akil's probably exactly to what you were talking about. Criteria number 5 in the standard is build trust in the design. And in the standard, we'll see like adopt transparent data handling, maintain a reliable service, these types of things. And again, how would we practically do this? One thing that I've seen and just thought through is, a user's digital rights are not only a production thing. When we talk about making alpha concepts or beta releases and these types of things, often we show real data and representative data and these types of things, and we just have to consider users' digital rights in those processes. Maybe they're only released to selected audience, captive audience, but at the same time, users have digital rights, so need to be aware of what's being put into those demonstrators. Make a privacy and data use policy clearly available, in particular in a production sense, but if it makes sense prior to that, then yes. Consider opt-in and opt-out user journeys. Typically in complex projects, we have a solution design, and this needs to be ideally security first. And the service we build should be secure by design. Salsa's built lots of systems in government, I guess, where, Essential 8 or ISM IRAP are in scope, and they have their own more stringent sort of security considerations. Again, we have to be security first. And we need to execute the security formalizations and make sure we're secure ongoing. So why? A useful, inclusive, and transparent service will build users' trust and confidence. And, the opposite, I probably don't really want to think about, but certainly it'll be antitrust and reputational damaging if some of these principles are not applied. Criteria number 6 is don't reinvent the wheel. So I was putting it to the audience in Drupal South, like we've all heard don't reinvent the wheel, right? And no one sort of said, I've not heard that. Of course, they didn't. We all know that. I was tempted to talk about an interesting tangential point where a friend of mine is actually reinventing the wheel, and that sounds really, really strange. But if you look at his thing called, he's got this disability robot, and he's actually needs to build special wheels on the robot because it's for stair climbing for disabled people. So I'll send you the link after this. But it's really, really interesting what he's done. But anyway, back to on point. So don't reinvent the wheel. Why? If we look at the standard, you'll see build once, use many, design for reuse data, etc. So again, how do we do this? My recommendations would be to have a consolidation mindset from the start. And this is one of these tips. It's probably more a philosophy than a tip. But I think if we have that as a mindset, it does help. as a point of reference or a principle in the project, the design, the project, the build, the rollout. Reuse opportunities can be explored in discovery and alpha phases. Continually brainstorm for reuse. I think often we sort of fixate on what we need to do in a service or the project, and reuse is thought about a little bit at the start and sort of neglected. And it, that can be related to budget or time frame, which I guess is my next point, which is share. And if time and budget allows, build for the greater good. This is a topic we talk often about in Salsa, in particular around share and give back and civic theme and other things that we've built. And I know Fiona on here is in the throes of this, particularly with civic theme. But I guess we've probably all seen this, but it can be really, really hard in a project where the project manager from the agency, government agency side has direct accountability for the project budget and the time frame. And so suggesting that we need to build for the greater good can be a complicated conversation, but really it is incumbent on government to share. So if we can have that conversation and have some sort of pathway to build for the greater good, not just for the project, it really can benefit the taxpayer, in particular for reuse, consolidation, sharing, efficiency, all those types of things. And obviously that's in a context wider than a particular project or service that's being built. In terms of don't reinvent the wheel, the principle, we touched on the use of open standards, and I mentioned sharing, but to make it real, contribute where possible. So this could be to open source projects and the like, in particular Drupal or modules that you can contribute. So again, we ask why. Really, it comes down to deliver value for government and familiarity to users by sort of reuse and contribution and sharing and all those great things. Number 7, do no harm. So from the standard, you'll see protects users' digital rights, and it's got a high overlap, in my opinion, with the criteria number 5 or 4. I can't remember which one, but the one around digital user rights and understand privacy. When we do these things, we do no harm, but how do we practically ensure that we do no harm? I mentioned in the previous one where the user digital rights are not only a live thing, but they also need consideration when we're in our alpha phases and our alpha designs and our beta builds and these types of things. So, do no harm also applies not only to live, but in those phases as well. Give special consideration to users facing greater personal risk. Undertake a privacy impact assessment. Obtain consent where required. This is really important. And have a clear data use policy. Communicate, show it, make it accessible to everyone. Why is this? To protect all users from adverse consequences. Criteria number 8 is innovate with purpose. From the standard, we'll see consider emerging tech. And if you're considering emerging tech, consider interoperability and backward compatibility. Be aware of new tech, these types of things. So how do we do this? And how do we be practical with it? Because it's very, very tempting to use new tech or latest shiny thing. But anyway, in terms of trying to control that, map innovation and new technology to a product service success criteria. It'll just provide more focus on what really matters. Prove approaches and the application of new technology. And this can be done in discovery, it can be done in alpha, and it can be done in beta builds and the like. Consider innovation spikes. With innovation spikes, maybe many people have used this, but at least from what I've seen, you can control the amount of innovation investment, and you can have a sort of a risk-based approach to exploring novel approaches and the application of new technology. And I guess innovation spikes can provide guardrails for the innovation investment. And I guess the idea is to help balance creativity um, and exploration with the sort of core of getting the service built or the project executed. Maintain a solution blueprint documenting innovation ideas. In this, and what I've seen well is not only can you document what's been tried and used and probably applied, but it's also sometimes valuable to document what's been tried and discarded, or maybe document just that's only been conceptually identified. Just to have a record of innovation is valuable for a project and in particular beyond, and can help justify why certain decisions are made, in particular with the application of a new innovation, new technologies, and these types of things. And again, why do this? A clear intent helps justify new approaches. If we innovate with a purpose, we balance creative thought opportunities and the core build and the delivery of the service. Criteria number 9 is monitor your service. And from the service, from the standard, I should say, you'll see things like setting up a baseline of metrics and measuring these metrics. And this is fundamentally a good practice, but how do you do it? What I've seen well is use discovery to start thinking about how you might monitor even those metrics that you might want to capture, and in particular, collect metrics that matter. Have a reason for reporting on a particular metric. Report on the metrics. Don't just collect them. Reporting drives better service quality and improved services. What we measure, we can understand and we can improve. So I guess it's the fundamental principle of having metrics and having monitoring. They need to be reported in a digestible way so they can be used. So, that's a challenge of projects. So why? We want quality of service to be owned. We need monitoring and metrics to drive ownership. I mean, I was talking before about having a service owner, particularly in a live situation. So having measurement assigns capability, responsibility, improvement even with the service owner. So only when we measure what matters can we sort of improve our service via ownership and continuous improvement. Criteria 10 is keep it relevant. Again, in the standard, we'll see improve the service across its life, relate assessments. There's things in there. Again, how to practically do this. My tips would be test relevance early. Use beta to test the effectiveness of the service. Again, put service relevance in the remit of the service owner. I've sort of touched on that a few times. Have a service roadmap. We don't need to sort of implement everything on the roadmap, but if we roll out MVP services and have a sort of some stepping stone or some guiding principles to sort of increase the service, its feature set or its quality, then that's always a good thing. Own the SLA. Again, the service owner comes into play here, particularly in live situations. And all this results in a managed or in better service quality. So again, why? Relevant services remain fit for purpose, even as the purpose changes. And this is important because, service firstly envisaged at a point in time can have different relevance from a service in a year's time. So if we're sort of always considering its relevance or its purpose, then we've got some way to make the service sort of flexible and adaptable to changing requirements. So those were the 10 principles of the DSS 2.0. Hopefully you sort of understand a little bit more about it now, or and some of the tips are, are takeaways. So when I was sort of at the conference, I was just sort of suggesting that, if nothing else, I would encourage people to consider each of the 10 criteria on your next digital projects or build of a service. Determine if any of the pro tips are applicable. totally happy to share further into my experience, compare notes, etc. But I've got some pro tips there, so have a look at those, unpack those. I think they're sort of well founded, or they're certainly founded on my experience. So hopefully they're sort of useful. And I guess maybe take a look at the why statements, and ask the applicability question again of each of those why statements. And because I've asked this a few times tonight, why do that? I guess I started off suggesting that building digital services which are user-friendly, accessible, secure, and efficient is difficult, and it is. But if we have a core set of principles to apply, we may have a tiny chance of realizing cohesion and connection in government, or at least playing our bit part in making it happen. These are the links to the digital experience policy, the 4 standards that I mentioned, and the first one is the digital service standards. So if you click in here, you'll see sort of some of those things, not my pro tips, of course, but you'll see part of the other context that I shared. There is such a thing as a digital services checklist, and when I first saw this, I know Keelan and I looked at it, and others in Salsa looked at this, and said, "Oh, beauty, we've got a checklist here." What I saw in this checklist is really the what. It's a checklist of the what statements. It's not really the how statements. So I'm sort of offering my own pro tips and how statements as a have a look at the checklist by all means, but I think you'll sort of see, do A, do B, do C without sort of necessarily how do you do those. There are other references on the digital.gov website, so I don't want to sort of talk it down too much, but all I'll say is, the checklist there, have a look at that, have a look at the other references, and I guess my pro tips can be a contribution to, how to make this all happen. I had the Q&A, but I'm happy for Q&A now if anyone's got any questions. I know Siobhan's got background on this, as we mentioned. Akhil's got some practical experience. We could discuss generally with you. But thanks for listening. And I guess I said this at the conference. I'm absolutely genuine in my offer to talk about this and share my experience. So if anyone wants to reach out beyond this talk, anyone's listening to this talk later and wants to reach me, talk about this sort of stuff, feel free.
So Paul, the comment that I would make is that, like, I know that this has been created for government and we think about it for government, but it's gold, right? Like, it's really should be beyond government.
Yeah, absolutely. In your experience, Julie, self-evident that the principles that we're talking here are not necessarily rocket science. They're well-founded guidelines of how to execute successfully in a digital program, service, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, that's not just the unique domain of government. That's just good practice of a digital rollout. So absolutely.
It provides a good framework though, as well, right? Which is what I did when I moved to the Australian Psychological Society and realized that there was not, maybe I shouldn't have said the name of the place, there was not great depth of knowledge or understanding about web and digital, right? So to get my stakeholders up to speed, I did a similar recording.
Yeah, I mean,
just and I explained like not everything is going to be fit for purpose. We're not going to be able to do everything as a small organization, but here is all the thinking. Here's the framework. We can cherry pick, what we feel we can use to help frame the new platform.
Yeah, I was just going to make the comment on that, Julia, like, you had your experience. I'm absolutely certain that's not a unique experience, that it was sort of quite immature, and therefore the application of these principles is, could really, really be really, really helpful. And you also made a good point, and I think someone asked me a question in the conference around how are they measured, how are they enforced, and I said we've tried to get to the bottom of that. It's been a little bit unclear how that is, but I think we should not focus on that, but more focus on these are really, really well-founded principles. Apply them to any project or every project, but not everything not every principle needs to be applied in its theoretical sense to every project. We need to sort of scale them to the complexity, the cost, the budget of the project, but they're all well-founded, so that at least should be considered one-on-one and applied as appropriate.
Yeah, I think the other thing is that they bring what I call a skills and expertise vibe into the ecosystem. And when I look at work that's done in other countries, you know, like through my experience at Splash Awards, Australia, New Zealand, you know, work is just so much more advanced. And I think that is because of this sort of type of framework, right? And the expectations of the level that we're performing at, you know, the kind of work that we're delivering.
Cool. One of the things I started off with is say, hey, this might not be the most valuable stuff to the developers in the room. So does anyone developer want to sort of give their own take on, you know, I'm in the code all day, but this is still valuable to me or not? I'm just interested in that.
I could put in a few points here. So for developers, so for example, like if you are already on GovCMS SaaS, if you have a site hosted there, it already takes care of some of the DSS points, for example, security and monitoring, right? So some things will be covered there. Another thing is like if you choose a good theme, a Drupal theme, it will take care of a good subset of the DSS points. So for example, in the article that I wrote, which Suchi would paste in the YouTube description eventually, I talk about civic theme and what it covers as it relates to DSS. So civic theme does cover a good subset of the technical points, at least. And I'm not going to list all of them now; it's quite a lot. But if you read the article, you'll see what those points are. So yeah, so choosing a good hosting and choosing a good theme would cover a good percentage of the DSS points.
And I think on that, Siobhan, it's really relevant because when we start speaking about whole of government solutions, be it GovCMS SaaS or be it, you know, civic theme as standard-based building blocks, you would hope that those things are aggregating the best of the best practices, right? And the best practices are almost inherently aligned with, you know, solid principles. And so these things come together in a way that, you know, every project or every service build doesn't have to build from first principles, all these principles in. That they've got some building blocks that have already inherently do some of these things, which is a good thing.
Yeah, correct. So like if you put a site on GovCMS, a new site on GovCMS today and install civic theme, for example, you already cover like maybe 60-70% of it out of the box, right? So it's a good starting point.
Yeah, which, you know, 8 years ago, whatever, when GovCMS was envisaged, Sharon and everyone at Department of Finance, it's part of what they're trying to do, right? Like consolidation, application of best practice, et cetera, make things more efficient, streamlined, cheaper. Yeah.
So if there are other developers that want to jump in, would feel free to do that.
Otherwise, as I say, I could speak for all day about it. There's lots of other interesting things to speak about, but my friend's invention. The name was escaping me. You'll have a look at this up. Or be lived. He'll be happy that I promoted it. Or be lived. It's a stair climbing robot for disabled people. And he had to invent this special wheel because the robot itself had to not scuff floors up, and it has to move in all sorts of different directions. So he had a wheel that could move in all sorts of different directions. And he had a 3D printer that made his own wheel. All be lived. Have a look at it. He'll be happy that I promoted it.
Paul, Damien has his hand up.
Oh, sorry, I didn't see.
Oh, good.
Yeah, thanks. I just had a question. I'm not very experienced in project delivery space, but I mostly work in kind of what we call SLAs or maintenance on websites. So I just had a question. Say you have a successful delivery of a project, but kind of over time, the project deviates from the standards. Do you have any experience in getting projects back on track or to get them to align more with those standards? I don't have any specific examples, but yeah.
That's an
Yeah.
excellent segue, Damien, because I was about to mention that as well. One of the things that you got to be aware of is that people often think of these standards from the big bang, the beginning of the project, but many of these things should be an ongoing, whether it's quarterly or regular cadence to review, to your point, whether it's accessibility, whether it's any one of these. There are more that are more relevant for the kind of maintenance side of the DSS than others, but most of these you can review. You can actually review all of them at, say, quarterly or 6 monthly, and at minimum every year. Look at the intent, because as you point out, there are deviations within the site, content structure, IA, and things do fracture, change, and evolve over time.
I would also add that performance and monitoring is also one of the things. So if your site starts to stray and it goes outside of the threshold, it would be a sign that you're venturing into unknown
Number 9.
territory.
Yeah, number 9
Right.
is the key one there.
Yeah.
I think it
And
is
they've-
really, it's a very great question. And, I guess in the presentation, I was sort of putting the impulse on the service owner to own the SLA, particularly when the service is in production, right? And it's probably just an extension of that responsibility to sort of own the service quality, be it accessibility, whatever it might be. But these principles absolutely, are ongoing into production situation, and they need a level of governance, otherwise things can unravel quickly. More questions?
Any other question? Anything else that anybody wants to talk about?
I want to know about the Orbi lift, Paul. Can you buy them? Or are
He's
they
got
still?
he's got an well, 6 months ago he had a working prototype. I don't think it's commercialized yet, but this talk's not about the Orbi lift, but since
Sorry.
Victor will be very happy. He's my old flatmate, by the way. When I lived in
Right.
Sydney, we lived together for 8 years. But anyway, he's put a lot of effort into this, and he can't buy, but that's what I was going to say. He's got a lot of relationships with universities and people in the disability sector, so a lot of interest, and much of the stuff he's done is patented, so he's got a pathway to commercialization.
Is he in Melbourne or
Sydney?
Sydney? Okay.
Yep. Yeah, but
We'll talk about it offline.
yeah, probably not for the video content here, but
Yeah.
I'm glad I got to plug in. I don't know if this is for the video either, Suchi, because we've sort of had an agenda tonight, but I'm interested in anyone that did go to Drupal South and what they might have liked and disliked. I mean, like I said, I had a look at Nigel's presentation offline like last night, and I really liked that, Nigel. So I've got a lot of questions for you on that, but we don't need to record it, I guess.
Yeah, I'll stop the recording for now.